All right, good afternoon. I wanted to show a couple of things, basically going through code today. Okay, so the first is just an example about putting rectangles on a screen. We've seen how this works out. Let me find it. There we go. That's what it does. It makes 3 rectangles. It labels them R1, R2, R3, and then it puts 4 other rectangles up here. And rotates them. So let's see here. This version of the code is basically right out of the Liang text. I haven't changed hardly anything. I took out comments that I thought were helpful. I put a comment block up at the top. And it's just showing you kind of repetitive stuff that we've seen for other shapes, right? So you have the basic shapes of circles and squares and rectangles. So all they do is the person who wrote this creates a rectangle R1, and this is 2510 is its position in pixels. 25, this is XY, so it's 25 to the right, and 10 is 10 pixels down. So again, we have this whole notion of we have a stage, we have a scene inside the stage, we have a pane inside the scene, and then we have nodes inside the pane. The stage is the entire window, including the ribbon on the top that has the name and the widgets to do the minimization, maximization, and closing. Inside is the scene, and inside there is a pane. There's only one pane here. And they start adding these entities. So the rectangle R1 is 2510. Remember, the origin is up here in the upper left corner, and plus X is to the right, and plus X is down. So it's different than your, quadrant 1 of the normal algebraic Cartesian coordinate system. Plus X to the right, plus Y is down. And they did that so that when you resize the window, the origin stays put. So if I resize this thing, the origin is the only one of those corners that doesn't move around. So they moved it 25 to the right and 10 down. Now that's the upper left corner of the rectangle. For each shape, you have to look at where the origin of the shape is. And then 60-30, it's 60 pixels wide and 30 pixels high. So 30 going down and 60 going across, but it's positioned up here. So that's its size, is 60-30. Then they do the next one a little bit further down. You'll look at, it's 25-50, so instead of 10 pixels down on the y-axis, it's 50 pixels down. And the third one is 90 pixels down. Everything else is exactly the same. Since they're all 25 pixels to the right, they line up. Don't worry about this arc width, arc height. They're just showing you can do cute things and clip off the ends of the rectangle. For the R1, they do fill it. They make the outer line black. They make the fill white. How do you do that? You use the colors. And as we said, Wednesday or Monday, you have to actually import color as an object in order to use color. How do they get the text on here? Well, rather than creating like text1 equals new text, they build the text directly inside the add statement, which is, clearly legal. It works. I recommend against it. I always like to create things separately and give them names and then add them by their name. And the reason is, if I ever need to get a hold of that thing later on, I want to have a name by which I can grab it. Remember, the name is just the handle to the object. If I ever need it again, I want a handle so I can grab it. So I'm not a fan of this creating things inside of the add method. So they add the text, and then they add R1, they add the text, they add R2, they add the text, they add R3. Now, how did they make that line up? Well, you kind of have to play around with this a little bit. They put the text 10 pixels over and 27 down, and it happens to line up nicely with the rectangle. How did they know that? They probably played around and guessed a couple times. Again, when I'm laying out GUIs, and my recommendation for you is the same, I first draw them out. And if I need to, I actually dimension them, just like I would dimension a part drawing in EGR 120. Sometimes I'll, sketch in the names that I'm going to use for these things. So you can spend a lot of time on a GUI just making sure things line up correctly. So they played around with 27. Now what you'll notice is the distance in the y-axis from the first rectangle to the second is 40 pixels, and the distance in the y-axis of the labels is 40 pixels. And the same with the second to the third, 40 pixels between the rectangles, 40 pixels between the labels or the texts. So once you figure it out for one, it's usually fairly easy to maintain the correct relationship for the others. So there's just showing you cute tricks about how to line things up. We'll find better ways to line things up by the end of the class today. Now what's this? This thing where they have 4 rectangles and they all rotate them. They created a loop where they create 4 rectangles. So I is from 0 to 3. And they create a temporary rectangle, R, inside the loop. It's at 150, and then it's at, well, its length, its width is 100, and its height is 30. And then they rotate it. Because there's 4 of them, they basically go 1/8 of a circle all the way around. And because this thing is going to go on either side of the center of rotation, that's going to make that nice pretty pattern that you see. Then they do an interesting thing here. They actually color it. That's one line. That's one statement. They color it using random numbers. Color.color, math.random. So this is going to be a random value for the color. Good to know. Probably useless. Good to know. They fill it with white, and then they add R. So they create R. They create R, they position it, they rotate it, they color it, and then they add it to the pane. Then they go through the loop again and they create R again. What happened to the old one? It doesn't go away. Once you've added it to the pane has that handle. We don't, because they really never gave it a good name, right? Or I should say they overwrote the name. But the pane will keep track of that stuff. And again, I don't recommend this either. If I create a bunch of rectangles, I want to have a way to grab each individual one in case I need them later. So they're just showing you interesting ways by which you can add things to the pane. Once they add all the children to the pane, they add to the pane to the scene, they add the scene to the stage, and then show. What I wanted to show you here was a different way to do this that I would recommend, that is in keeping with the kind of coding principles I keep talking about. First of all, you'll notice there are two things. There are no attributes here, right? If there was an attribute, they would start on line 23. So this class has no attributes. And then the second thing to notice is they do everything inside the start method. And the start method, let's see, it goes from, if we go from the endpoint, line 56, and it starts at line 24, 56 and 24 is 32. So 32 lines big. And there's just a lot of detail in here, nitpicky detail of setting up the text. My recommendation is don't do that. Don't put all the nitpicky detail inside the start method. Remember I said earlier with the main method, don't do all your work in the main method. Instead, the main method is generally more easily understood if you have a bunch of methods that do the things that you need done. And then you give them good names. And so I would recommend the same thing here. I would rather have some methods and replace this block of code here. Let's see, this block of code is from line 26 to 50. That's 24 lines big. So I would rather replace that block of 24 lines of code with a couple of method calls. Do the work outside of start. And then if I name them nicely, you know what's going on. And the reason I say that is because number one, if you start to code this stuff without breaking it up into the smaller chunks, as you're coding, you can get lost in what you're doing. This is a really easy, simple GUI. And the GUIs you're going to do for your projects are probably more complex and probably going to take a lot more lines of code. And they're all just down in the weeds, kind of dirt lines of code. So as you're creating your GUI, you can actually get a little bit lost. You know, you stop for lunch, you come back, oh, what did I do? Or you stop and you come back to it next week, what was I doing? What does this mean? What does that mean? But if you do things in terms of methods, then you can clarify the organization of the code so that as you're writing it, it's easier to understand. And if you need to modify something, it's easier to modify. More importantly, once you start debugging or doing code maintenance, you know, some of you guys, I hope, will keep your projects and work on them, you know, after the semester, and you go back to look at it 6 months from now, you know, you need to write code that you can understand 6 months from now. You know, and we've all had that experience of, what the heck was I thinking when I wrote this code? I don't understand it. So my recommendation is to do it with small methods. Now, in order to do that, you can't use R1 is a local variable. See, where there's no attributes here in this class. R1 is a local variable. And local variables that are in the start method are only accessible inside the start method. So I would convert all of these to attributes, and then I would convert all this work to methods. And I would just do a couple simple methods. That's a method to create those first 3 rectangles. That's a method to create the rectangles that spin around on top of each other. And that's a method to create the pane and populate it with rectangles. So if you look at this code, I've created the pane and the rectangles as attributes, and now I have access to them via the methods. And look how short, instead of those 22 or so lines of code, I have 3 in my start method. Now I'm going to have those lines of code out in the methods, but each one deals with a small, simple task, so it's easier to understand what's happening at any point in time. Make rectangles, okay. That sounds like a method that's going to make rectangles. And then make rectangle array. That sounds like a method that's going to make the rectangle array. And then I should make that 4. And then make pane with rectangles. Oh, okay, that sounds like the one that's going to make the pane. And it adds the rectangles to it. You could have done that in 2, make the pane and then add the rectangles to the pane. So I've reduced in my start method only to this simple line of code. And again, I strongly recommend in your main methods and in your start methods that you do this so that you can just read through and at a high level, based on the method names, get an understanding of the basic functional chunks that your program is broken up to. Okay, first I have to do this. You know, I have to initialize all my data. Maybe that should be done in a method called initialize data rather than putting 20 lines of code in your start method. Particularly when you get to have GUIs that are more complex than this. You know, I've seen students with 100 lines of code, and you know, my recommendation is don't clutter up the start method with that stuff. All right, so what do the methods look like? I basically just cut and pasted what we had before. Where's my cursor? There we go. So I cut and pasted those lines. And because these are attributes now, R1, R2, R3 are attributes, that method has access to them. And when I go back to other methods, those methods will have access to them too. So I can create the rectangles here, and then other methods can add them to the pane. And then I made the rectangle array. Now, again, I said I always want to name everything in all the widgets that I make so I have access to them later in case I need them. So I made an array of rectangles. And now I can always access them. I called it R array, which is a lousy name, but what the heck. I can always access each individual rectangle. It's the ith rectangle. So what am I doing? I actually put 3. If I had 4 of them, it would be 0, 1, 2, and 3. So R array 0 and R array 1 and 2 and 3 are individual rectangles that I can grab a hold of. And the rest of this was basically cut and paste. Other than that, I changed the reference here from R to R array, I, you know, the ith element. And so that set up my attribute for the rectangle array. And then this is a little bit different, but it's a useful thing. Most of you will use this. And we'll talk about why in a bit, but basically you're going to put a pane within a pane at some point. So it's a good idea to make that pane, the one that I've got a top level pane and then I've got a lower level pane. It's generally a good idea to make that lower level pane separately. In fact, usually you will have a separate file for it, a separate class. And then you can make that lower level pane separately and just add it to the higher level pane. We'll talk about how to do that in a few minutes. So here I make a method that actually builds a pane, and look at its return type. It returns a pane. Now remember what that means. A pane is an object, and so it's returning really the handle to that object. So what's happening is when I go up here to pane equals make pane with rectangles, pane is an attribute. It is not an object yet. It's a placeholder for a handle to an object, because I never said pane equals new pane, right? So it's a placeholder for the handle to the object, or a handle to the memory where that object is stored. And since this thing returns a pane, what is it really returning? It's really returning a handle to a pane. So this guy is waiting for someone to give it a handle, and this thing returns the handle. And all I do here is I create a new pane, a temporary one. It's local to that method. And then I add all the children. And I didn't change this text code. I don't like it, but I just cut and pasted it in for efficiency's sake. And then in my for loop, I added each of the individual array elements, array I, right? Array 0, R array 0, R array 1 and 2 and 3. And then I returned the temporary pane. And again, what is that? We've talked about this when we talked about objects before. If I say object 1 equals object 2, what it really means is the handle for object 1 is equal to the handle for object 2. And that's what's happening. When I return temp pane, I'm really returning the handle to that object. But to me, this is clearer. Look at I went from 22 or something lines of code to 3. And if you're looking through code and trying to understand it, you know, normally you want to get a high level view of what's happening. And then the parts that you're interested in, that's where you want to go into the detail. It's kind of like when you look at a textbook and you need to find a specific piece of information, what do? You open it up to the chapter listing in the front. Which chapter has the information that I'm interested? Then you just go to that chapter. Well, that's kind of what I'm doing here. Right? If you want to know about any of these individual methods, then you go down into those methods and look at them. But if you're just trying to understand the flow of the program, you don't want that detail yet. So you're going to do it here. You know, look at just by reading those method names, you should have some idea. Okay, so that's the last bit of discussion about just the basic GUI elements, you know, how to make a circle, how to make a circle, how to make a square, how to make text. The way that you get better at this, again, is when you're doing your individual GUI elements and you need to know how to do something, use the Oracle help pages, use the tutorials. You know, again, I showed you the other day, each of these GUI elements has, you know, 200 or so different methods and a bunch of different attributes, of which you probably need 2 or 5, you know, some very small number. So we could spend a whole semester just on walking through each of the methods for these things, and it would be, you know, a grueling, miserable semester, right? So understand the basic concepts, and then if you need to do special things, that's when you start to Google around and look for tutorials, look for the Oracle help pages. Remember to include Java FX in your search, though. It doesn't help you to get a swing component. Okay, I'm going to pause here before I move into the different forms of panes for questions. I also want to make sure my code worked. So I'm waiting for questions while I do this. Okay, yeah, see, there's my version and it looks exactly the same. Did the same work. All right, let's talk about different kinds of panes. There's basically a pane, a stack pane where things stack on top of each other, a pane, a stack pane, a flow pane, a grid pane, a border pane, which is going to be fairly important, and then a horizontal or H box and a vertical or V box. So I'm going to just show you these and how they behave differently. By the way, with a stack pane, things really do stack one on top of each other. And I had a student one time who created 6 buttons and only one showed up on the screen. And he said, I know I made 6 buttons. I know I made 6 buttons. And after looking at the code for a while, I said, oh yeah, you do have 6 buttons and they're all stacked one on top of each other. So what you're seeing is the topmost button. You know, you have to go through and set layout X, set layout Y for each of those buttons. Otherwise, it was just going to put them all in the middle of the screen and stacked them right up. So being aware of how these things work. This is a flow pane. And the reason it's called a flow pane is because whenever you enter a new GUI element, it just puts it in line, one after the other, one after the other. And when it hits the end of the window, it basically does a line feed. So if I change the length of the window, it keeps flowing. See, it's a flow pane, it flows. And then if I, okay. So the good news is it flows. And the bad news is, let's say you spend a half an hour lining this thing up and it looks lovely and you really like it. And then the user changes the size of your window and screws everything up. So you can use a flow pane. There's nothing wrong with them. It's a good first example, I think. If you are going to use a flow pane and you spent hours lining this stuff up, you might want to lock the size of the window. You can set, I think sizable is the attribute. Sizable set, you can set it to true. You can set it to false. How did they get this thing? Let's see, flow pane, flow pane, flow pane. There it is. Now, these are the Liang text examples that came with the text. I did not modify these at all. And so you're going to hear me complaining about the way they did this a little bit. Again, talking about code quality, code improvement. So they created a flow pane. And then they did this stuff where they set some padding and set an H gap and set a V gap, a horizontal gap, a vertical gap. That's just about when you put things in a row, you don't want them smashed up against each other. So the padding is, if you think of each element inside of its own little space, the padding is how much space do you have from the element to the edge of that space. And then the gaps are the gaps between the spaces. And this comes from, if you're familiar with working with tables at all, that's a very common thing, that you set the padding for the content of the table cell to the edge of the cell, and then you can set gaps between the cells. How do you know this stuff exists? Again, examples. By the way, in order to set the padding, they had to import a whole new object. How would you know? Tutorials and examples. So they did this, and then they did this adding children. Instead of doing add, they did a different method called add all, which allows you to add multiple children at the same time. I think it's a good thing to know. I think when you're first learning how to do this, my recommendation is they should do it the same every time. So I'm not thrilled with how they did this, but that's okay. When I get to it, I'll modify this one too. But this is me complaining about the author. This is all well and good if you already know a lot about Java, but if you're first learning Java, it's nice to have a little consistency. So what did they do? Rather than make a label and name it and then add it by name, they made it in place right inside the add method. Absolutely legal. You've seen that it works. In terms of code clarity and code understanding, I would argue not to do this. And then never do this. This is a new text field. Oh, let's see. What did they have to do? They had to bring in labels and they had to bring in text fields. What's the difference between a label and text? I'm not sure there is a clear difference, quite frankly. I know with both you can set fonts and set up styles and things like that. All right. So remember, before they were using text under their show rectangle, they built text, not label. Why? I don't know. They're almost the same animal. Okay, so they created the new label. What have I done? Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. I was on the wrong file. That's what I did. Okay. So they create this label first name, and there it is, first name. Then they create this text field, and that's this thing here. It's a text field, and that's just, since they didn't put any parameters in, that's the default size for a text field. And it works. I can type, I can do text. Now it doesn't do anything yet, right? It's just there, and I can put text in it, but I can't do anything with it. And then they did the new label MI. And then they did another text field, but they wanted to make it short, like for middle initial, right? You only need one element in there. So sure enough, text field, and they gave it a name this time so that they could set preferred column count to 1. And then after that, they went and did this add all again, and they added the TFMI. Now, by the way, notice they prefaced it with TF, text field. Not a bad idea. Whenever you make a button, maybe its name should be BT blah, blah, blah. Whenever you make a text field, it should be TF blah, blah, blah. Not a bad idea. So they add TMI, and then they make a new label, and they make a new text field. And notice this one's the same as that one because it's blah, 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 blah. Oh, by the way, even though they made this one column big, it accepts more than one letter. It accepts a bunch. It's just you can't see them all at the same time. What if you actually literally only wanted one character to be in there and then the user couldn't put any more in there? Can you do that? Absolutely. You go to text field, and I forget the attribute, but there's a method by which you can set the maximum number of characters that it will accept. Now they created this, again, they're just displaying a flow pane, so they don't care. They created this text field, and they created this text field, and they never gave it a name. So you will never do that. Why? Because what do you put a text field in for? You put a text field in there so the user can actually use it and type in something, and then the program has to go grab that content and use it. And if that text field doesn't have a name, there's no way you can go grab that content. Technically, there probably is, but oh my gosh, it would be awful. Give it a name. Give it a name. Here, it didn't care so much because, again, they're showing they're trying to show off the flow pane. But my recommendation is, get in good habits early, right? In my opinion, name everything in your GUI. All right, that's a flow pane. It's a good first example. I don't know, I'm not a fan of them because of this behavior, but sometimes that's the behavior you want. If you don't want that, if you want something that actually there it is, grid pane. Oh, that's a nice layout. And not only that, when I change the window size, it stays nice. And this is a more common element that I see students use. If you have a project where you need the user to input a bunch of information, a grid pane is almost always a good way to go. And what do? They create the pane, and then they add one child at a time. Because it's a grid pane, not only do you say what you're adding, you say where you're adding it at by mentioning the column and the row. And the only thing that's a little bit weird about this, it's pretty straightforward, is that it's not row column, which is the normal way people use indices. It's column row. I always forget that. So whenever I use a grid pane, I always, check it out first and put in a couple elements and make sure, okay, wait, is it column first or row first? It's column first. And just like in an array, the upper left is the 0, 0. That's the 0 column 0 row. This is the 1 column 0 row. This is the 0 column 1 row, right? So we start at 0. This is the 1, 1, the 0, 2, 1, 2, and then 0, 3 is blank and 1, 3 is not blank. So since it's a grid pane, you get to say where you're going to put this thing, which is nice. And then it will size the grids appropriately so that everything lines up. If you want to, can you make it where the grids have a standard minimum size? Absolutely. You have to go look at how to do that though through the help pages. So they add the label first name, they add the text field, they add the label middle initial, they add the text field, last name, text field, and then they add a button. And as always, we can type in here, blah, blah, blah. There's my middle initial. There's my name, and I can click the button and nothing happens because again, this is nothing but the view. This is the view, but there's somewhere there would be a model, which they don't have here, and that's appropriate because they're just trying to show you panes. So somewhere there would be a model, and the idea is this button should be the connector between the view and the model. We would have a controller, and this button click would kick off a method in the controller to make some analysis happen. And next week, we're going to talk about how to do that. So the basic GUI process, in my opinion, make the nodes, add the nodes to the panes, add the panes to the scene, add the scene to the stage, and then before you are done, then the next part is anything that's a button or anything that you want to actually interactive, as you're making them, you actually have to actually direct which methods are going to be fired off when the event happens, when the button gets clicked, or even when the pane gets clicked. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. If you have questions, just interrupt me. Okay, so that's that. Let's go to border pane because this is going to be a fairly critical one. And a border pane. These guys love these little tiny windows. I am not a fan of the little tiny windows. A border pane is composed of 5 areas. And in each area, you can put another pane. So remember I said panes can contain panes? This is how you can do it. If you only put something in the center pane, for example, you put another pane in there, then the top, left, right, and bottom would all disappear. Basically, whatever is not used, the space goes to 0. But you might want to use these. And why would you want to use these things? Well, it's very common to have, and you've seen this on countless websites and other software applications, it's pretty common to have a pane on the left that's like a navigation pane or user options or settings and options. And then in the middle, you actually have the content. Or it's common to have the content and then across the bottom, you have navigation, user options, these kinds of things. If we look at Notepad++, it's got the pane that has the content, that's my code. It's got a pane over here with nothing but numbers to tell me my line numbers. It's got a pane on the top that has the widgets by which I can control things and do things. And then on top in the window, it's got the drop-down menus. Those are not technically part of the pane. So I don't know if this was written in Java, probably not, but the idea that you break up your window into these separate areas is pretty universal. And again, you've seen it on virtually every website that you've encountered and virtually every piece of software that you've encountered. The way most people are going to use it in class is a lot of people, when they start their project, they want to have like a splash page or an introduction page or a login page. And then when that's done, they go to another page. Well, each of those pages is a pane. And how do you go from one pane to the next? How do you swap that out? It turns out the easiest way is to set the pane in the center. So if we look at how the border pane works, there we go. Each of these areas gets its own pane, and because it's a demo, they put a pane in every single one. And they made one called a custom pane. And look at set center, new custom pane. So what you can do is you can build two separate panes, introduction pane, game pane, right? Introduction pane and or login pane and database pane, whatever. You create two of those, and initially you set the center to be introduction pane, and when someone clicks the button, it just swaps out. You just click, you just fire off a method that swaps out. Okay, now you're in your analysis pane or your game pane or you know whatever your project is. It's a pretty easy thing to do. So they created this custom pane top, custom pane right, custom pane bottom, custom pane left, custom pane center. And then they did a horrible thing. What is this custom pane? Well, it's just what it sounds like. It's not part of the normal Java hierarchy of panes. It's a custom made pane that they built, and it's down here. So the actual you know, show border pane class ends here. See the red brackets? And then inside the same file, they create a separate class inside the same file. Is that legal? Clearly it's legal, it just worked. Should you ever do it? No, no. If you're building a custom pane of your own, build it in a separate class, and then you can reference that class. You do not want to do what they just did here. I cannot think of any reason why you would ever want to have a class and two classes inside the same file. Now, in your textbook, they will talk about the ability to do that. They talk about private classes, and maybe, I don't know, maybe once in your professional life, you'll have a real reason to do that. It is a really dirty trick to play on someone who's trying to understand your code. Because every class should have its own file, and that's the expectation. And if you start to hide classes in other classes' files, that's like hiding stuff from people. Please don't do it. But the idea behind the border pane is fairly simple. It's got pane, set top, set right, set bottom. Whichever one you don't do just goes to 0. For example, let's take the top and right pane out. I'll just comment them out. And then I'm going to see, there they are, top and right. And then I'm going to recompile. And then I'm going to show the border pane again. And look, they just disappear. Whatever you don't use just goes away. I need to put these back before I forget. And they're back. Okay, so that's the show flow pane, grid pane, border pane. The other things you might do is the horizontal and the vertical boxes. And the reason is, if you look at, oh shoot, I got rid of it. If you look at how the border pane is set up, the bottom and the top, what a natural place to use a horizontal box, and the left and the right, what a natural place to use the vertical. And so if we look at the H box, V box example, ta-da, we get images and stuff. That top bar with the gold color is a vertical box, a V box. And again, these buttons don't do anything. And then the courses down here, this listing is an, I'm sorry, the top is an H box, right? Horizontal, and then this is a V box, a vertical box. box. And the vertical box, as you would expect, just lays things out one on top of the other vertically, and the H box lays them side by side. And unlike the flow pane, let's check this out. See, they shrink, but they don't line feed like a flow pane does. They don't flow. How is this created? Well, let's see. If that's an H box, that's a pane, and a V box is a pane. Those two panes must be inside of another pane. And that's exactly what happens. They create a pane as a new border pane. What a surprise. And then they set the top. They do a get H box method, set left, get V box method. So they're doing what I was recommending before, right? That you actually do all your dirty work outside of the start method. And the get H box and the get V box, all they do is get H box makes up an H box, and the V box makes up a V box. And I'm looking at this, trying to see what they did here. Courses equals new. Okay, so the sequence of labels. Oh, I see. For each one. Okay. Then they did all this dirty stuff. See, this is what I'm talking about. Look at how much work it took to set up that H box. And you don't want all that junk just cluttering up your start method, because it's really not doing anything very interesting. It's all layout stuff. And layout stuff is just a lot of lines of code for very little effect, other than, it makes the GUI look right. But there's a lot of visual clutter there for someone who actually needs to understand the code. If I really need to understand the code, if I'm having problem with my code, the problem is probably not that I had a button 5 pixels off. That's probably not the problem. And if I need to understand the code, if in terms of think in terms of code maintenance, code, you build code and next year you want to go back and expand it or reuse it. You want to have easy understanding. And again, in order to understand it, you probably don't really need to understand that much about where the pixels were for the buttons and the text fields. Probably. Your understanding and your problems come from the model more than it does the GUI. Oh, and making the GUI and the model talk, of course. Okay, so this week has been just about, introduction to Java FX basics, how to get the basic elements on the screen. And, you're going to have a question as you go through your own project. Hey, can I do this with the GUI? And my answer is going to be yes. And I don't know how to do it, right? That's going to be something to research. Now, I'll help you do that, right? If you're partway there, or if you know specifically what you want, I might know, or I might know where to go look and help you with that. But there's a lot that goes on here. Even, they even talk about, look at that. Oh my gosh. That's more of a HTML cascading style sheet format. Why is that? Oh, because these Java objects are compatible with HTML cascading style sheet formats. How do you know that? You see these examples. Okay. We'll talk about images. I'm going to talk about images probably in another lecture. I think we're good. But you can look at the image file. As always, I'm going to post these up online separately probably tonight. And so the first batch that I posted, they all start with FX01, FX02. Those are the files that I took from Liang and then modified. This group of files are just going to be straight from Liang. I didn't modify them, but I'll post them tonight. And again, as always, rather than watch me do this and listen to me blab away, run them, change them, modify them, see if you can, hey, I wonder how I do this with a circle. I wonder how I, if I can do such and such with a rectangle. Ask yourself those questions and actually try to make it happen. And then that's the best way to learn this stuff. And I do recommend, as you're doing your project, not in your project code, because you don't want to mess it up, But if you're wondering, oh, I wonder how to do this, I wonder how to do that, make a little side piece of code, make a little separate mini project that you're going to throw away just as a proof of concept, then start programming on your project code, because otherwise you can pollute your project code pretty badly. I will have more examples next week that are more sophisticated than these simple examples that start to introduce how to get more complex GUIs and some actual user interaction. Okay, any questions before we go? And of course, if you have any, message me on Canvas or put them in the discussion pages. All right.